Malawi's power shift, Chakwera concedes, Mutharika returns, a test for African democracy. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where Africa's stories are told with courage, context, and clarity. I'm Zainab Karoma. Today, we turn our eyes to Malawi, where President Lazarus Chakwera has bowed out gracefully, conceding defeat and withdrawing his court challenge, while Peter Mutharika makes a dramatic comeback at the age of 85. What does this mean for Malawi and for Africa's democratic future? Let's break it down. When Lazarus Chakwera instructed his Malawi Congress Party, MCP, to withdraw the judicial review challenging the September 16th presidential election, after earlier conceding defeat, he may have delivered what many observers will regard as his final act of statesmanship. The move signaled a clean exit from legal contestation, undeniably dramatic in tone, but with profound political symbolism for Malawi and for Africa's broader struggles with democratic transitions. Let us unpack the political import, the risks and limits, the comparative context across Africa, and what might lie ahead. The Chakwera exit. Courage, constraint, or convenient retreat. Statesmanlike, but not without calculation. On the face of it, Chakwera's decision is admirable. By conceding defeat before the final tally and then ordering withdrawal of the court appeal, he granted Malawi a peaceful, relatively uncontested transition. Rare in many contexts, especially under conditions of weak institutions. Observers have congratulated him for prioritizing stability and democratic norms over protracted litigation. Yet one must ask, was this truly a selfless gesture or a recognition of political reality? Reports indicate that preliminary tallies already indicated a strong lead for former President Peter Mutharika, circa 56.8%. versus Chakwera's approximately 33%. The legal route might have had little chance of reversing the outcome. In that sense, the withdrawal may reflect a pragmatic acceptance of defeat rather than pure magnanimity. Moreover, withdrawing before the courts potentially reduces the risk of a protracted constitutional crisis, which Malawi, with its fragile economy and pressing development challenges, may have been ill-equipped to endure. Legal and political trade-offs. It is worth noting that Chakwera and MCP had sought a restraining order to delay the announcement of results over alleged electoral irregularities, a move the High Court rejected before being allowed to seek judicial review. Had the court accepted the appeal, it might have plunged the country into uncertainty or encouraged parallel claims of legitimacy. By stepping aside, Chakwera arguably avoided fracturing the judiciary's standing or undermining public trust further. But there is risk, too. Closing the legal chapter so swiftly may leave unanswered questions about accountability. If genuine electoral or procedural irregularities occurred, those are likely to fade into the background, absent formal scrutiny. Thus, Chakwera's exit is statesmanlike, so long as one accepts that some grievances may never be redressed. Africa on watch, comparisons, patterns, and ironies. If Chakwera's graceful exit is to be a model, Africa offers both aspirational parallels and cautionary counterpoints. Southern Africa, peaceful handovers, but not always clean. In the southern region, transitions are often smoother than elsewhere. South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, and Mauritius have set relatively high bars for peaceful succession. However, peaceful does not always mean faultless. For instance, in Namibia's recent presidential election, despite the victory of the first female president, there were court challenges alleging technical irregularities. A reminder that even in stable democracies, contestation persists. In Botswana, too, electoral disputes have occasionally surfaced, though institutional trust has generally held firm. Malawi's example thus reinforces the notion that peaceful exit matters, but it does not guarantee legitimacy if underlying structural flaws remain unaddressed. West and Central Africa, strongmen, coups, and transitions in name only contrast Malawi with other recent African developments. In Guinea, a constitutional referendum in September 2025 could empower junta leader Mamadi Doumbouya to run for president and extend terms, hardly the democratic ideal. In Mali, the military regime has moved to extend its own rule and curb political pluralism. Burkina Faso's junta has also extended its stay in power, citing instability. Thus, while Chakwera's exit is a hopeful exemplar, the wider African picture is mixed. Some transitions are hostage to military ambition, weak institutions, or constitutional manipulation. Peaceful handovers remain exceptional rather than the norm in many contexts. East Africa, promise unmet, transitions delayed. In East Africa, the record is also uneven. Uganda's ruler Yoweri Museveni has repeatedly amended terms and nullified limits to cling to power. He now aims for yet another term. In Kenya, transitions have been legalistic and fractious, though the 2017 and 2022 shifts showed some maturity. That said, the underlying institutions remain fragile, and opposition parties are often throttled via administrative tools rather than transparent competition. Chakwera's act might be most resonant in those environments where leaders are still judging whether to respect electoral defeat or push the envelope of constitutional maneuvering. What does the latest in Malawi tell us, and why you might raise a brow? Since Chakwera's withdrawal and concession, other events in Malawi and beyond have shifted the frame. Mutharika declared winner. The Malawi Electoral Commission announced that former President Peter Mutharika won with 56.8% of the vote, defeating Chakwera, approximately 33%. Historic rivalry renewed. This marks the third electoral showdown between these two men. Mutharika first won in 2014, lost via court annulment in 2019, then lost to Chakwera in the 2020 rerun. Economic tailwinds. Chakwera's term was marred by economic strain, inflation topping 20%, food insecurity, droughts, cyclones, and depletion of foreign reserves. These factors likely influenced public sentiment, making the concession less surprising than romantic. Regional praise, cautious optimism. Southern African Development Community, SADC, election observers, and regional leaders have lauded the move as a model transition, though many warn that praise should not obscure institutional weaknesses. So yes, Chakwera's withdrawal makes headlines. But whether it will be seen as noble or merely necessary will depend on how smoothly the transition proceeds and whether Malawi's next era addresses systemic deficits. Looking ahead, will the curtain rise or the cycle repeat? Chakwera's departure is not the final act, but perhaps a pivot point. Here are key trajectories and fault lines to watch, with a dash of speculative humor, because politics loves little curveballs. 1. Legitimacy versus governance. The test begins immediately. Transition is not enough. Performance matters. Mutharika inherits a country in turmoil. If his government mismanages the economy, suppresses dissent, or reverses democratic gains, the public might rue the absence of a protracted legal reckoning. Conversely, effective delivery of stability, no matter how incremental, could transform nostalgia for Chakwera's gesture into real goodwill. 2. Institutional reform. Not just management handover. Chakwera's exit can inspire, but if elections continue to be tainted by weak logistics, voter suppression, or opaque procurement, then tomorrow's statesman exit may look hollow. Strengthening election management bodies, judicial independence, and enforcing accountability, e.g. electoral offenses, will be critical. One positive in the regional sphere. In August 2025, a workshop in Abuja brought electoral management bodies, EMBs, together to strategize countering disinformation, a recognition that Africa's digital age complicates legitimacy in new ways. 3. Civil society, youth, and media as guardrails. If civil society and journalism can stay independent and vigilant, they may help prevent backsliding. Given that Malawi is a relatively small country, a mobilized NGO sector and active diaspora could influence whether the transition remains statecraft or slides into patronage. 4. Regional contagion. Will Chakwera be a case study or footnote? If the SADC, AU, and ECOWAS begin to invoke Chakwera's exit as a benchmark, it could gradually shift norms that leaders concede before fighting in courts, instead of after, or not at all. But unless such gestures become widespread, they risk being isolated anecdotes rather than templates. In much of Africa, transitions are still zero-sum. Either you win or you push the legal envelope, or worse, you stage a coup. Chakwera's choice nudges the balance toward responsibility, but only if emulation takes root. The big question is, how many will bother reading his playbook? The Constitution question, a strong script or loose stage directions? Malawi's democratic resilience has often leaned on its judiciary and constitution. Recall that in 2020, it was the Constitutional Court that boldly annulled the fraudulent 2019 election, paving the way for Chakwera's victory. That ruling was hailed globally as a triumph for African judicial independence. But here's the paradox. The same constitution that empowered the judiciary also leaves plenty of room for political brinkmanship. If courts become overburdened with endless electoral disputes, they risk appearing partisan. If they recuse themselves too quickly, as in this case after Chakwera's withdrawal, some irregularities may never face accountability. The balance between judicial activism and judicial restraint is delicate. For comparison, Kenya, 2017. Supreme Court annulled the presidential election, earning international applause, but also domestic backlash, with judges branded enemies of the people. Zambia, 2021. Peaceful transfer of power without court battles enhanced confidence in institutions. Uganda, every election since 2001. Courts routinely dismiss opposition petitions, often citing insufficient evidence, undermining trust. Malawi's next challenge will be constitutional housekeeping, clarifying timelines, thresholds, and accountability for electoral irregularities, so that statesmanship does not have to compensate for systemic gaps. Regional diplomacy. Malawi, as a small state, big example. Malawi is no giant in Africa's geopolitical chessboard. With under 20 million people and GDP hovering around $13 billion, it is dwarfed by Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. Yet its political choices ripple regionally because they defy stereotypes of fragile states descending into authoritarianism. SADC in particular has embraced Chakwera's concession as a poster child of democratic maturity. This is strategic. The bloc is still haunted by crises in Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and Mozambique, where contested legitimacy has fueled conflict. Having one member show democratic responsibility provides SADC a useful counter-narrative. But will Malawi leverage this for regional influence? Possibly. Chakwera himself once chaired SADC. Even in defeat, he may find a second life as a regional mediator. Imagine him lecturing Museveni or Doumbouya about how to step aside gracefully. That would be Africa's version of poetic justice. The youth factor, Africa's largest voting bloc and the least patient. Africa is the world's youngest continent, nearly 70% under the age of 30. In Malawi, the average age is just 17. This demographic is less interested in symbolic statesmanship than in jobs, food prices, and internet bundles that don't cost an arm and a kidney. Chakwera's biggest failure, critics argue, was not electoral management, but economic delivery. Inflation above 20%, fuel shortages, and food insecurity pushed many into frustration. Young voters who rallied behind him in 2020 as a pastor-turned-reformer turned away in 2025. This pattern mirrors broader African dynamics. Nigeria, 2023. Youth-led #obedient movement energized elections but failed to secure victory. Senegal, 2024. Youth protests forced the government to restore democratic timelines. Zambia, 2021. Youth voters propelled Hakainde Hichilema to victory, ousting a complacent incumbent. The lesson? Symbolism wins you applause abroad, but jobs win you elections at home. African leaders who ignore this may end up celebrated at AU summits but voted out by restless young citizens. Cross-national futures, the next acts in Africa's democratic play. Looking forward, Malawi's experience feeds into 4 continental debates. 1. Will concession become normalized, or will it remain the exception, celebrated precisely because it is rare? 2. Will EMBS, election management bodies, be strengthened, or will they continue to serve as scapegoats when results are contested? 3. Will youth activism transform into institutional reform, or will it remain episodic, visible only during protests? 4. Will democratic statesmanship spill over borders, or will military juntas and sit-tight presidents treat Malawi as a quaint anecdote rather than a model? If Africa is a stage, Malawi just delivered a moving monologue. But the audience, citizens across the continent, are less interested in applause and more eager to see if the next act brings real reforms, a sprinkle of humor before the curtain falls, for now. Let's be honest, in Africa, conceding defeat is sometimes treated like spotting a unicorn, rare, dazzling, and immediately trending on Twitter. Chakwera may not have delivered the economic miracle Malawians hoped for, but at least he gave the continent a meme-worthy moment: how to lose an election gracefully, without Netflix calling it a drama series. Meanwhile, across the continent, leaders are probably watching with mixed feelings. Some are thinking, that's noble. Others are whispering, over my dead constitution. The economic outlook. Under Mutharika, old wine, new bottle. Peter Mutharika, at 85 years old, is back in State House, which makes him the continent's newest member of the octogenarian President's Club. But while age brings experience, Malawians are asking whether it will also bring fresh solutions or recycled rhetoric. Key challenges facing Malawi's economy. 1. Inflation and food. Insecurity. Inflation soared above 20% under Chakwera, exacerbated by droughts, cyclones, and currency depreciation. Maize shortages pushed households to the brink. Mutharika campaigned on promises of price stabilization and food security. But delivery will be the true test. 2. Foreign reserves. Malawi's forex reserves fell to under 1 month of import cover earlier this year. That's like running a marathon with only a sip of water in your bottle. Unsustainable. IMF assistance and donor goodwill will be critical, but those come with conditions. 3. Corruption and public finance. Chakwera inherited and struggled with the Cashgate legacy, and his own government faced scandals over procurement. Mutharika must now show he can cut wastage and rebuild trust. 4. Youth employment. With over 50% of Malawians under 20, job creation is not just an economic priority, but a political survival strategy. Without it, expect more protests than praise. Comparative lens. Zambia's Hakainde Hichilema, 2021 to present, came in promising economic reform, but now faces falling popularity due to rising living costs. Ghana's Nana Akufo-Addo initially won applause for free education and infrastructure, but debt and IMF bailouts undermined his legacy. Nigeria's Tinubu is discovering that subsidy removal wins applause from economists but fury from voters. Mutharika's second act will therefore be judged less on his symbolic comeback and more on whether he can deliver bread, jobs, and forex stability. Lessons for opposition parties across Africa. Chakwera's Rise and Fall offers a handbook with warnings scribbled in the margins for opposition groups elsewhere. 1. Winning is not the finish line, governing is. Chakwera's 2020 victory, hailed as a people's triumph, quickly soured because expectations outpaced delivery. Opposition parties in Africa often excel at mobilizing anger but stumble when it comes to managing economies. 2. Unity is a temporary marriage, not a lifelong romance. The Taunts alliance that swept Chakwera to power fractured once the honeymoon ended. Coalition politics, unless institutionalized, often collapses under the weight of patronage battles. Kenya's NASA coalition and South Africa's opposition PACs face similar risks. 3. Narratives matter. Chakwera's servant leadership appeal resonated in 2020, but faded when scandals and economic struggles dominated headlines. Opposition leaders elsewhere, whether Bobi Wine in Uganda, Nelson Chamisa in Zimbabwe, or Ousmane Sonko in Senegal, must learn to sustain narratives beyond election day. 4. Don't outsource legitimacy to courts. Malawi's 2020 annulment boosted Chakwera, but in 2025, the courts couldn't save him. Opposition groups need grassroots trust, not just legal strategies. Risk of democratic backsliding post-Chakwera. Here comes the irony. While Chakwera's concession is being praised, Malawi may still face democratic erosion. Why? 1. Aging leadership, shrinking innovation. Mutharika's advanced age raises questions about succession. Will he govern directly or via a cabal of advisors and relatives? Weak leadership at the top can embolden patronage politics and sideline institutions. 2. Ruling party dominance. The Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, now controls both the presidency and significant parliamentary influence. Without strong opposition cohesion, Malawi risks sliding into winner-takes-all governance. 3. Judiciary's fragile reputation. If courts are seen as political tools or conveniently bypassed, public trust may erode. Remember, the judiciary gave Malawians their democratic revival in 2020, but if it is sidelined now, accountability could weaken. 4. Donor fatigue. International partners may celebrate Malawi's peaceful transition, but applause does not buy maize. If governance falters, donors could reduce support, forcing Malawi into unpopular austerity measures. Comparative warning signs. Tanzania, post-Magufuli, peaceful transition didn't prevent creeping authoritarian controls. Zimbabwe, post-Mugabe, a celebrated exit gave way to recycled repression. Guinea and Mali, early celebrations of new dawns faded into entrenched military rule. Unless Malawians remain vigilant, today's applause could turn into tomorrow's regret. A dash of humor, because politics without laughter is just tragedy. Let's be real. Africa's politics sometimes feels like an endless Netflix series. Chakwera's concession was season finale material. The hero bows out gracefully, credits roll, soundtrack swells. But in typical African style, just when you think the series has ended, the producers announce, coming soon, the return of Mutharika, Season 3. Meanwhile, across the continent, opposition leaders are scribbling notes. Step 1, lose gracefully. Step 2, hope history redeems me. Step 3, don't forget to trend on TikTok. Malawi as mediator, small state, big norms. Malawi just delivered one of those teach the continent moments. An incumbent who conceded before the final tally and then withdrew his court challenge, clearing the runway for a peaceful handover. That sequence is well documented. Chakwera conceded on September 24, 2025, with preliminary tallies showing Peter Mutharika far ahead. The next day brought headlines that the MCP would withdraw its judicial review bid, a move the SADC observer community promptly framed as democratic maturity. Could Malawi parlay that into a soft power niche? Quite possibly. In regional politics, moral authority often matters as much as economic heft. A country that normalizes concessions and de-escalation can credibly host delicate talks, share election management know-how, and chair peer learning forums. Think SADC/ECF-SADC. SADC's own preliminary statement machinery was visible and vocal this cycle, giving Lilongwe an opening to deepen that cooperation and export the don't torch the house after you lose norm. The real test is follow-through. Will Malawi move from one exemplary concession to sustained institution building, credible EMB logistics, transparent result publication pipelines, dispute resolution timelines that other states can borrow? Parallels: Botswana, Cape Verde. and the art of punching above your weight history suggests small African states can shape continental norms when their institutions speak louder than their GDP. Botswana, decades of predictable elections, conservative macro policy, and professionalized public service turned it into a governance reference point, even when critics note dominance party fatigue. Cape Verde, serial peaceful transfers of power and a well-regarded election administration gave it a disproportionate seat at democracy roundtables. Malawi's path could rhyme with these examples if it institutionalizes what just happened: stable transitions, sober rhetoric, and non-theatrical courts. If Lilongwe couples that with public financial discipline and open civic space, it can host regional peer reviews, troubleshoot electoral logistics, results tech, parallel tabulations, observer accreditation, and send respected retired jurists as mediators. Cue a little humor. If soft power were a soccer match, Malawi just nutmegged half the region. Now it must score by codifying the playbook. The external triangle, IMF, EU, China, and the Mutharika constraint, Peter Mutharika returns at 85 with a clear popular mandate, 56 to 57% of the vote per official tallies, but inherits a macro bind. Inflation in the high 20s to 30s, forex scarcity, and a recently terminated IMF program that disbursed only $35 million of an intended $175 million. Any grand plan will live or die by how deftly Lilongwe navigates the IMF-EU-China triangle. 1. IMF, the gatekeeper of credibility. The IMF's ECF program ended in May 2025 after reviews stalled, with staff citing forex market distortions and fiscal slippage. A fresh arrangement, post-election, would unlock concessional finance, catalyze EU support, and anchor inflation expectations, but will demand tougher FX discipline, cleaner procurement, and debt transparency. No IMF, no anchor. With IMF, expect tight belts and political noise. 2. EU and other donors. The standards for support trade. EU budget support and sectoral funds tend to follow IMF signals. They'll cheer this transition, but money usually chases credible medium-term frameworks: public financial management, social protection targeting, health education delivery. Expect governance triggers, audit clauses, and green transition nudges attached to euros. 3. China, pipes, roads, and pragmatism. China's comparative advantage is speed on infrastructure, transport, energy, industrial parks, often with fewer upfront governance conditions. For a forex-starved government, EPC plus finance deals are tempting. But the debt picture is already tight. Any new Chinese credit must fit a transparent IMF-compatible debt path or be structured as PPP/FDI rather than sovereign loans. Bottom line, Mutharika's fiscal room is a studio apartment. To furnish it, he needs an IMF anchor, EU cushions, and carefully sized Chinese appliances. What a realistic 12 to 18-month roadmap could look like. Quarter 1 to 2, stabilize. FX reforms to narrow the parallel market and rebuild reserves. Targeted fuel/import prioritization. A lean supplementary budget with cash management rules, social cushioning for maize and transport. Open books, publish top 10 contracts, and an arrears plan to regain donor confidence. Quarter 3 to 4, rebuild, agriculture, climate-smart inputs, warehouse receipt systems, and regional grain compacts. Energy, fix distribution losses, pilot solar mini-grids where grid rehab lags. Jobs for youth, public works plus MSME credit guarantees. Digital skills apprenticeships tied to BPO/Agitech. Quarter 5 to 6, reform, debt, transparently sequence restructurings, and cap new non-concessional borrowing. Procurement, e-procurement expansion, blacklisting for non-performance, publish beneficial ownership. Elections governance, lock-in lessons learned, result forms digitization, logistics audits, dispute timelines. Sprinkle of honesty. None of this is glamorous, and all of it is hard. But boring reforms beat exciting crises. Risks to watch, because plot twists are a regional specialty. Governance drift, an aging presidency delegating to rival factions could stall reforms. Austerity fatigue, if IMF-style consolidation bites too hard without visible wins, fuel stability, maize prices, social patience will fray. Debt surprises, undisclosed liabilities, or SOE guarantees can derail donor re-engagement. Regional shocks, another El Niño-style drought or supply shock could erase early gains. Argue now for regional food energy compacts under SADC. A light touch of levity. You could say Malawi just gave Africa a masterclass in how to lose an election and still win respect. The sequel, unfortunately, is never titled How to Tame Inflation in 90 Days. If only Netflix funded macroeconomic reforms with the same enthusiasm it funds political docuseries. Key recent sources for the latest developments, results, concession, macro backdrop. Reuters, Chakwera concedes ahead of results, economy context, September 24, 2025. AP News, Mutharika declared winner, approximately 56%. Chakwera at approximately 33%. Al Jazeera, Electoral Commission confirms approximately 56.8% for Mutharika. Nyasa Times, MCP to withdraw judicial review at Chakwera's instruction. SADC SIOM, preliminary statement page for Malawi 2025 general election. Reuters, IMF program ended after only $35 million dispersed. Inflation and Forex strains, May 15, 2025. Reuters, inflation approximately 28.5% year over year. Growth cuts, Forex shortages, February 28, 2025. Donor coordination, herding cats or conducting a symphony. Malawi's economic survival will depend not just on what Mutharika does in Lilongwe, but on how he coordinates with external partners. Right now, it looks like a messy orchestra. IMF plays first violin. It sets the tone with a program that restores credibility. Without it, others hesitate. EU, UK, and multilaterals, World Bank, AFDB, bring the brass section, budget support, infrastructure loans, health education aid, but only if the conductor, IMF, is on stage. China supplies percussion, loud, visible infrastructure financing, often delivered quickly, but which must be sequenced carefully to avoid debt imbalances. NGOs and civil society are the background choir, often overlooked, but they build legitimacy through service delivery and governance advocacy. If Mutharika's team can align this orchestra, Malawi might deliver a symphony of stabilization. If not, expect more off-key solos, donor fatigue, and another episode of When Bailouts Collide. Small state leverage, lessons from the minnows who roar. Malawi's best hope for regional stature lies not in GDP size, but in reputation leverage. Botswana, Cape Verde, and Mauritius have all proven that small states can punch above their weight when they institutionalize good governance, elections seen as boringly predictable rather than contested dramas. Export technical know-how, Botswana in diamond governance, Cape Verde in election systems. Host high-trust dialogues, Mauritius in trade and arbitration. For Malawi, the opportunity is to brand itself as the democracy doctor of SADC, a place where lessons in electoral dispute management, judicial independence, and peaceful concession are documented, codified, and shared. That soft power can compensate for hard power deficits. Advice to African leaders: statesmanship is cheaper than state collapse. 1. Lose gracefully if you must. Concession is not weakness. It's insurance for the day you want legitimacy again. Ask Goodluck Jonathan of Nigeria, who remains globally respected despite losing in 2015. 2. Invest in boring institutions, courts, electoral commissions, procurement boards. They don't trend on Twitter, but they prevent crises that do. 3. Feed your youth, not your ego. The largest voting bloc in Africa is under 30. They want jobs, data bundles, and stable prices, not endless constitutional amendments. 4. Don't gamble with Forex. You can rig votes, but you can't rig maize prices or dollar reserves. Economic pain is the fastest delegitimizer. 5. Think legacy, not longevity. Africa remembers Nelson Mandela more than the leaders who clung to power for decades. statesmanship outlives seat warmership. Key messages in summary. Chakwera's concession and MCP's court withdrawal mark a rare act of statesmanship in Africa's political theater, praised across the continent. Mutharika returns with a mandate, approximately 56%, but inherits daunting economic challenges, inflation, forex shortages, and donor fatigue. Malawi could carve a niche as a small state punching above its weight, exporting democratic lessons and mediating regional crises. The IMF-EU-China triangle will shape Malawi's economic future. Careful sequencing and transparency are essential. Comparative lessons show that opposition parties must master governing, not just campaigning, and that concessions must be matched by institutional reform. For Africa at large, real leadership is less about holding on to power and more about passing the baton without breaking the race. Final note, with a wink of humor. Conceding defeat may not fill Malawi's maize silos or stabilize its currency overnight, but it has bought the country something rare in African politics: respect. And in diplomacy, sometimes respect is the only hard currency that never devalues. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAVI, your trusted source for critical analysis, Africa-wide comparisons, and forward-looking perspectives. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into Africa's most important stories. Together, we keep Africa's bold voice alive.